Hi everyone, it's Tanmay, and I will be doing the Flowers of Shanghai style presentation. Okay, so I just have this slide here just to sort of compare the previous work that we saw from Ho and his average shot lengths. And just looking at Flower of Shanghai shot length at 158 seconds, it had been the longest in Ho's career up until that point. And I think it's important to bring that up here because I think it's indicative of sort of the differences in Ho's stylistic goals and also the experience that he wants the viewer to have. This is my subthesis. To aid the audience's critical engagement with the banal and emotionally hollow lives of the dynastic elite men and the oppressive conditions of the flower girls, Ho obscures emotional access to the characters, not only with distancing wide shots, but also with dorsal staging and the displacement of viewer focus in frames filled with people. Furthermore, he confines his characters with overwhelming mise-en-scène and aperture framing, allowing little to no negative space in his compositions. By blocking subjectivity and crowding his shots, Ho allows the viewer to ponder the superficiality of the characters' relationships in the flower houses. In the flower houses, sorry. Um, so compared to the rest of the Ho films we've seen, one thing that I'm going to contend is that Flowers has much more rigid intrinsic norms, and what I mean by that is you don't really see a lot of variation in Ho's visual style. As I indicate with one of the first stylistic tendencies, most of the shots are these sort of fluid, wide shots that last about roughly 158 seconds. And what I mean by fluid wide shots is the camera is sometimes moves by itself. The camera is sometimes cued by character movement, or it is motivated by character movement. And I think this sort of creates the framework for the how I'm going to explore the rest of the stylistic norms and how they fit into Ho's uh, uh, goals. Um, and so we have here dorsal staging, congested frames, congested with either people or congested with mise-en-scène, telephoto lensing, aperture framing, and also the repeated motif of Yoshihiro Hano's Flowers of Shanghai theme. Um, and I've starred the ones that I'm going to talk about in length, the telephoto lensing and the musical motif. I will talk about that briefly towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about here is dorsal staging. And what I mean by dorsal staging is that Ho many times literally turns the characters back to us as they express their emotions to one another. During moments of major emotional expression, frustration, sadness, and affection, Ho makes his character Ho blocks access to character subjectivity uh, and creates a rift in the emotional identification and proximity that the viewer has to the romantic relationships in the film. One can see these implementations in the way that Ho's stages Master Wang and Crimson scenes together. This deliberate lack of frontality prompts the viewer to start to consider how the systems that these characters inhabit simultaneously oppress them. Okay, so I wanted to take some time to look at this first example. So the camera fades in from black into, uh, into crimson crying, and notice first that the scale of the shot is this wide shot. And we start with Crimson crying, and she's facing away from the camera. The camera then sort of dollies and pans to Master Wang. Um, Given the context, she's crying because of the affair that Master Wang is having with Jade, and the fact that he's not being intimate with her, despite clearing all her debts. Eventually, we get Master Wang, who goes up to her and he tries to console her, and then eventually they kind of reach a level of reconciliation. What's interesting here is that Ho dorsally stages Crimson while she's crying, but interestingly, also when Master Wang moves in closer to her, their affection and his emotional expression, this very sort of sweet emotional expression, their backs are facing towards us. We don't get access to it, despite it being maybe a place that another filmmaker would want to get closer. Uh, so here we see Ho doing this thing where he not only with shot length. shot scale that he distances the viewer, but also by literally turning the backs of these characters to us. So we can see this in another example where we start with this aperture framing, which, like I said, I will talk about later. But we see a lot of Hou's tendencies working here. So we have this aperture framing that also creates these leading lines that lead to that lead to our characters, both Crimson and Master Wang, and the camera sort of dollies in. And then after that, we get a very similar patterning from the previous example where it's Master Wang trying to console Crimson. Here, again, you see this dorsal staging where he is initially sort of confrontational and mad at her for ignoring him. And then eventually, Hou makes him fully turn his back towards us, as you can see in that third screenshot leading out into the third part. And then which is right here. And then Hou kind of lets that moment rest, and then eventually they reconcile. But again, we don't get any access. Their backs are faced towards us again. So even when we go through this kind of quick emotional change in this scene, the camera still stays at a kind of an objective distance. Plus, their backs are faced towards us. Um, yeah. So in this third example, this is the last scene of the film, and here the important distinction is that Crimson is here not with Master Wang anymore because now he's in Guangzhou. But interestingly, I think this last scene also evokes a similar dorsal staging strategy, except here. There's not just an obscuring of the emotion. There's really no emotion, period. There's just a few exchange of glances here where I think she is with the actor that she had an affair with. And he just sort of smokes his opium. And again, we see something similar where we see the leading lines that lead to the dorsality of the actor here. And again, here we see Hou trying to implement the strategy of dorsal staging uh, and sort of emphasizing this this lack of emotion and this lack of intimacy that occurs, and that's particularly painful here because um, uh, Master Wang's literally is not in the shot. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to start. I'm going to start touching on what I like to call the displacement of viewers' attention. So what I mean by this is in scenes, particularly the table sequences that feature a density of supporting characters, Ho buries his main characters within a sea of supporting characters. Uh, uh, through the viewer, through the viewer searching for Master Wang, Crimson, and Jasmine in these shots, Ho always diverts the viewer's attention to the periphery as other characters engage in gossip and make merry with games and drinks. On an even larger scale, Ho always has various characters exiting and entering the frame. In effect, Ho encourages the viewer to not just consider their surroundings, or the character surroundings, but also considering how these peripheral activities eat away at the possibility for real intimacy in the lives of our main characters. So the first example I just want to sort of jump into is this scene that happens, the very first, actually, the scene that we get into, we see this drinking game I think they're playing. And this is the first thing that we see. Notice how the majority of the frame is filled with these supporting characters. And all of them, and Tony Leung is just inhabits this really small space right here. So right here, so immediately we can start to see this intention of distracting and displacing the viewer's gaze and having them explore the frame, while we obviously Tony Leung is having a particularly emotional experience, and he is one of the stars of the show, stars of the movie, so we would be sort of drawn to him, but Ho wants to also pay attention to the periphery. This is a little bit later in the shot. This is when I think Master Hong leaves with a group of his friends, and what's interesting here is that we start to create this negative space here. Ho immediately with the camera pans to the left and crowds the frame again with more characters. Uh, and here you see this sort of gossip that's going on about Master Yufu and his relationship with Crystal. Um, and so here we can sort of see his tendency to do this kind of displacement and sort of, excuse me, um, sort of, keeping Tony Leung very small in the frame, and also but giving the rest of the characters more room here. And I think ultimately the effect here is that these peripheral activities particularly uh, aren't particularly emotionally impactful for the viewer, but they're a sort of sensory perception thing that takes over the frame more than our main characters here. Um, and also another interesting thing here uh, is that the character here is talking about this intimacy between young Master Yufu and Crystal, uh, and interesting. That's kind of what Tony Leung and Master Wang and Crimson and Jasmine, that is what they lack, and a lot of these characters in this world sort of lack. It's this real emotional intimacy is what they're missing. So I just want to jump into the next example, and this happens sort of later at another kind of table sequence drinking scene with them celebrating Tony Leung being transferred to Guangzhou. Um, so here you start to see a pairing of strategies with not only with this kind of viewer displacement, the displacement of the viewer's attention, but also the dorsality. So here you can see Tony Leung is right here, roughly. Is sort of, we can't really see his face, his back's to us. Um, but then again, the viewer's eye is sort of drawn to the drinking, is sort of drawn to the toast that they're having for Tony for Master Wang. Um, and again, you can see Ho is really crowding these frames again with his characters, um, making the viewer's eyes wander and placing more of the ancillary characters to the viewer's attention and focus. So interestingly, there's a cut to black, and then he sort of cuts to the other side of the table, and then Ho sort of pans the camera to the right, slash dollies. And again, we see this emphasis and on these ancillary characters that are playing these games or talking gossip. And again, Master Wang is not given a lot of space here. Uh, in fact, he's even being obscured by these by these candles. Um, Again, we're seeing this dominant, consistent strategy of displacing the viewer's attention onto these sort of more superficial ancillary activities. Okay, so the next thing I want to touch on is the way that Ho incorporates mise-en-scène. Given the opulence of the flower houses, Ho shows a demonstrated interest in trapping the characters with specific configurations of the mise-en-scène. And where and how these characters move within these constructed spaces. This is especially obvious when there are only two characters in the shot. In fact, even if a bit of negative space becomes available, Ho responds by moving the camera so as to allow maximum congestion in the frame. So here's a few examples I kind of want to lay out. So as we can see in this first, on the top left, we can see Master Wang with Jade, and they're sort of sitting down. And you can sort of see, the various furniture around them. It really feels like they're trapped. Um, and moving to the next example, we can see this conversation that's happening about Master Luo buying Emerald's freedom, and interestingly, again, you see how Ho places the table and these various elements of the mise-en-scène, making it feel very claustrophobic. And what's very interesting is that the context of their conversation is about Emerald's freedom. So really, there's this interesting, very tightly woven content and form happening there. And again, here we can see more sort of crowding of the mise en scène. Here he's doing a little bit with depth, where you have the lamp, and then you have some more of the more lamp and more of the furniture, and you really just feel like they're sort of cramped in the space. And then we have another shot on the left here. Again, we see these characters being flanked by the table right here, the teapot. Uh, Yes, all these different elements. There's really not a lot of room for them to move, making it feel very claustrophobic. Um, and something else to consider is the top two shots are kind of or more closer medium shots, and then the bottom two are a little wider. But we see a very similar strategy of sort of congesting and packing the frame with just these elements of mise en scène that are opulent but also quite restrictive for the character's movement. Okay. So, following his interest in emphasizing the congested lives of the dynastic elite and the flower girls, Ho does incorporates a lot of aperture framing. So he creates a lot of smaller frames within frames, using both architecture and also utilizing the oil lamps. And I think this strategy further accentuates the emotional isolation of the characters and also their congested lives. Um, yeah. Let's go to the first example. So architecture is aperture. So we can sort of see one of the scenes here, and this is the scene where they see the accident that happens outside, and you can see Ho is kind of utilizing not only depth, and you see this pairing with the crowding of the frame as we with people that we sort of talked about earlier, but we also see these extra apertures being created. So again, we see these kind of congested lives that we get this feeling of congestion. The viewer does, and also on top of that, what's interesting is that they're looking outside, in this very small through this very small window, which kind of further brings that out. Um, and again, he's utilizing elements of the architecture here. Jumping to the next one, we see again him using elements of the architecture. To create this very congested feeling. And what's interesting here is also the content of the scene, which is Emerald, her freedom from the flower house. Okay, so now I'm just going to jump into the oil lamps. I think what's interesting about the oil lamps here is not only do they draw the eyes of the viewer to whoever's talking, whoever the object of attention is, but also they also turn into apertures, and Ho sort of pairs this with his camera movement as well. So here you can see in the first one, you see that the two lamps kind of create this aperture um, around around Crystal and around Master Wang. He kind of moves the camera to the right, and then it eventually becomes a divider between the two of them when this confrontation about his outrage that happened a few scenes ago, and so that kind of becomes this divider. And then on the third example, we can sort of see a combination of architecture and the lamp. So we see the architecture here framing her, and then we see the lamp here framing, I think, Master Wang, and I think this is Master Hong, if I'm not correct. I think it's Master Hong. Um, okay, so we've sort of looked at the dominant strategies here. Furthermore, I also wanted to talk a little bit about telephoto lensing. Um, what's interesting here is I think Ho utilizes telephoto lensing and this sort of shallow depth of field uh, to have these very specific focus points, and he always focuses on a specific area of the frame. And this, of course, creates this very shallow depth of field. Um, where focus also helps in kind of creating this very claustrophobic uh, feeling. Um, and something else that I wanted to touch on was also the repeated Yoshihiro Hano's theme, um, which I am going to try to play. that's something we've definitely heard while watching the film. It's repeated. It's always played when we sort of fade in from the black into a scene. Um, and I think what he does is he pairs this with that to further the sense of entrapment and banality for these characters in their day-to-day experiences um, in the flower houses. Uh, but what are these characters exactly trapped by? And I think Jake does a really good job in his narrative presentation. It's the transactional nature of these interactions between the patrons and the courtesans, and how this creates emotional voids for Master Wang, Crimson, and other characters. These seemingly pleasurable surroundings become suffocating, and they don't really fill the voids that matter, which are the emotional ones. Um, Oh, my bad. Okay, so jumping to what I would call an exception to the intrinsic norms, we do get this close up of a hairpin, I think, and it's sort of paired with um, Master Wang, Master Wang's narration. This is a very interesting choice, and I think a major diversion from the intrinsic norms that Ho has set up here. Which and then that's sort of followed with this medium close-up shot of Crimson, which is probably one of the closest shots we've seen her in. Um, this is a very direct access to both Master Wang's subjectivity through voiceover and also Crimson's subjectivity through proximity of the camera. Um, what's interesting is he's talking about how Master Wang is talking about how he could not marry Crimson despite paying off her debt since her parents didn't, and basically saying that her parents didn't want to get her married to him. Um, so this is kind of an interesting thing where we start to see these exceptions and these sort of insights into subjectivity, uh, and, and how that's sort of mirrored in these diversions and these exceptions in the stylistic norms. Um, and I think these happen in very specific instances uh, throughout the film. And Zong, in the next portion of this presentation, will examine another such sequence in his close film analysis. And that's the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.